We'll begin our first session today called A Neighborhood Approach to Understanding and Addressing Crime in Peel Region, and it will be presented by Dr. Dana Wilson. Dana is an adjunct professor here at the University of Toronto, Mississauga in the Department of Geography, is the researcher for Peel Children and Youth Initiative, and is also vice chair of Safe City Mississauga. Please welcome Dr. Dana Wilson and enjoy the session.
Thank you. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. I know it's a little tight after lunch, and so thanks for being here. I have a lot to cover, and I do, as Major Callahan said, she had a tendency to speak quickly. I also have the same tendency, so certainly raise your hand if you'd like me to slow down a little. Talking today about a research project that completed in the spring, a 2-year project co-funded by the Region of Peel and United Way Peel Region. So just to preface the research, I'm going to talk about a little bit about what we know about crime and health and the connections between crime and health. Obviously, there are a number of connections between not only direct but also indirect connections between and impacts between health and well-being from crime. So we know that there are direct impacts on the health and well-being of victims from physical, emotional trauma, from victimization, lower life satisfaction, fear of crime, concerns for safety. We also know that there are a lot of indirect impacts, not only on the victims, but also members of the community, members of the family, and support around those victims. Stress, anxiety, lower life satisfaction, residential satisfaction. We also know that, that crime can adversely impact offenders through the same way. We know that mental health issues are often offenses committed, so we know that most often offenders are not in a good place when they do commit an offense. What we know about safety, health and well-being, safety is a basic physical human need required for successive social needs towards greater life satisfaction. So Maslow's hierarchy of human needs shows safety just above the physiological needs for life. So just above food, air, water, and sleep is being safe, living free from harm or threat. We spoke about that. We heard about that this morning. Protection of the body, employment, resources, morality, the family, health, prosperity. So safety is a fundamental need as well as a right, and certainly before we can successively progress to things like love, belonging, esteem, self-actualization, to greater life satisfaction in the community and among individuals. What we know about crime in Canada? Well, we've got a lot of good news. Police-reported crime rates have been on a downward trend for the last 20 years. So we're seeing Canada is an increasingly safe place to live, according to police-reported statistics. Also, the Crime Severity Index, which measures not only the volume but the actual severity of crimes, has also been on a downward decline in all CMAs, central metropolitan areas throughout Canada. Ontario has the lowest CSI in Canada, and Toronto has one of the lowest of all the CMAs in Canada, and Peel Region being the lowest of all for a city of its comparative size, so being over 1 million. We also know that youth crime, so youth defined by 12 to 17-year-olds, has been dropping as well, so there's lots of good news. Just showing you trends of the total crime, property crimes, violent crimes, a trend across time from 1962 to 2011. We certainly saw a spike in around the 90s, but we've seen things steadily declining. So this is a good news story, certainly. One thing that hasn't declined are victimization rates, so those that are not police-reported. So while police-reported crimes are on a decline, self-reported victimization rates have remained stable. So according to the General Social Survey conducted by Stats Canada in 2009, and this number has remained consistent, 66% of all criminal victimizations are not reported. So we know that there's a lot that goes unreported that is otherwise undetected when it doesn't enter into the justice system. Over 25% of Canadians 15 years and above reported being a victim of a criminal incident in the past year. And what we also know about victimization are that victimization rates are generally highest for 15 to 24-year-olds, so young people from across all types of crime. So young people are most often to be victims, and also often we know they're most often likely to be involved in crimes at a young age. What we know about Peel Region? Well, again, another good news story. We're seeing that Peel Regional Police being Brampton and Mississauga, so 95% of the population of Peel is run by Peel Regional Police, and Caledon being under the jurisdiction of the Ontario Provincial Police. That Peel has the lowest crime rates for all CMAs of comparative size, as I mentioned. Furthermore, Brampton, Mississauga, and Caledon all lay claim to the safest city and/or town in the country for compared to their size. So it's a good news story we're seeing among youth and adults that the crime rates have been declining in Peel. So overall, this seems like a good news story in terms of Canada, what we know, in terms of Ontario, in terms of Peel, and again looking at Mississauga specifically here today. So our average levels of crime look quite good compared to other regions of our size. So what then is the problem? Are we missing something? There's a lot of energy and interest in crime prevention, as you see here today, and a lot on specifically youth violence as well as other specific populations. However, it looks like our data looks quite good. However, what we also know is that the current data that we do have available does prevent local municipalities such as Mississauga, such as Brampton, and Caledon to actually understand the full picture on crime, as well as youth crime in particular. So we don't actually know whether there's an equal burden of crime across the region of Peel, and we don't have the sense today here specifically what's happening in Caledon versus the region that the OPP runs in a whole, and we don't know necessarily then how to reduce crime for specific populations either at the local level or amongst specific subpopulations that the general public or community stakeholders don't necessarily have access to that data. And so then how do we address crime for everyone, and how do we also address crime for specific populations or areas that might be more vulnerable? So as an example, looking at youth, youth under the Youth Criminal Justice Act does not fully extend to our working definition of how we consider young people. Most other social services and organizations consider young people to be 15 to 24-year-olds. Well, the Youth Criminal Justice Act considers 12 to 17-year-olds. So the youth statistics that we have are for that much more narrow definition of young people, which isn't necessarily one that we all work with as actively. Also, our youth crime rates specifically, they do not include youth diversion numbers. They don't include school incidents or cautions, which have not actually amounted to an official charge. So there's a lot more young people that are actually involved. The Peel Police are involved with a lot more young people on an annual basis than those who are actually being charged officially. And as you see here, looking at 2007, 8, 9, we are seeing that school incidents are increasing, pre-charge diversions are increasing, and there are a large number of youth cautions that are given out every year. So there's actually a lot more to the youth picture that we know Peel Police are working actively to prevent them from entering the justice system, but there's a lot larger number of young people who are potentially on the cusp or in need of other supports, so we know that a lot of the work that Peel Police does is actually around prevention. So around 80% of the work that they're doing with youth are with prevention, and then 20% are actually dealing with that 2.9% offender rate. Victimization rates in Peel, as we know, we don't have a local sense of what that looks like, but we know that nationally that the rates have remained steady. So there are a steady and reported victimization rates of 2/3 suggest that there is room for further exploration in Peel specifically among vulnerable subpopulations. We also know youth in particular, national victimization rates are the highest for young people, and males, again, are most vulnerable as both victim and as offender. We know that there are also anecdotally that there are cultural groups in Peel where there are specific cause for concern, unrelated crimes, for example, among South Asian populations such as elderly and women, and other groups that we know are cause for concern in Peel. So this project then had 3 objectives: to describe sociospatial patterning of crime and social conditions throughout the region of Peel, to identify priority neighborhoods for further exploration, to develop and pilot a social observation survey tool to actually go into neighborhoods and measure the characteristics that may relate to both crime and health and well-being, knowing that the two are inextricably linked. And then 3, develop a more in-depth understanding of the connections between crime, safety, and well-being in local neighborhoods and in a neighborhood context, through a qualitative exploration with local experts who are involved with service provision locally in communities. So the first piece was an environmental analysis looking at census data from 2006, as well as a gun-related offense database from the Peel Crown Attorney's Office from 2006 to 2010. The second piece was the development of a survey tool. So going around into neighborhoods with a checklist of a whole bunch of characteristics I'll talk about to figure out what's happening in these local neighborhoods. And the third piece, then a qualitative piece around interviewing key informants. It was a community-based approach to ensure the research is meaningful and relevant based on local priorities. Because the funders of this research, United Way of Peel Region and Region of Peel, established a community advisory committee, which included the provision of input and steering of research objectives throughout the process to make sure that it was resonated with what local organizations wanted to see out of this research. So this list here is at any given moment during these meetings throughout the project that ended in the spring. Basically, all of these people had input. All of these organizations were represented in terms of what actually unfolded as the project unfolded, essentially. So what we knew from looking at this gun-related database from the Peel Crown Attorney's Office is basically any time there was a gun-related offense that occurred between 2006 and 2010, they were included in a specific database that the Crown Attorney's Office was working on. So looking at these numbers, so 562 cases where a gun was seized illegally, so not talking about hunting rifles here. What we see when we look at the numbers of who these people are, 60% of them, just over 60% of them, were actually young offenders, so between the ages of 14 and 24. So we're seeing a burden of offenders certainly on the young population, and 99% of them were male. So we know that there already classically is a disproportionate burden on males in the justice system, and now certainly knowing now that they're the same is true for young males. So looking at where these offenses took place, geocoding them into their local neighborhood environments where the actual offense took place, we can see, just to have a look throughout the region, again being Mississauga and Brampton, not Caledon, where this data came from. Again, this is from the Peel jurisdiction under Peel Regional Police, that we see that the actual offenses are not evenly distributed throughout Brampton and Mississauga. We see certain pockets where it looks like that are maybe more prone to offenses taking place, or where police presence is stronger and more likely to catch offenders. And looking at comparing what we know about where these offenses are taking place, is there a burden on particular neighborhoods? Well, looking at things like average household income and all sorts of other indicators around socioeconomic status and around vulnerable neighborhoods. So looking in this particular map is, again, Brampton and Mississauga, but it's actually looking at average household income. So the map is showing the darker colored dissemination areas. So pockets at the local level are, the darker ones are higher affluence. So again, we know that similar to our crime rates, we also know that our average household income for the region as a whole is quite high. One of the reasons why we are struggling around funding for certain things is because relative to other jurisdictions, we may have low crime rates and we may have high income, but we do know that it's not an even distribution and it's not a happy story for everyone. So this is just showing you that, yes, there are pockets of affluence and yes, there are pockets of poverty throughout Peel that we all know full well. So the lighter areas indicating lower income areas. So when we look at linking the two together, where are offenses taking place and where does income as a proxy for poverty exist? Well, we can see that there may very well be some areas that look more prone to having the coincidence of both gun-related offenses and low income in the same area. So without speculating by looking at just the spatial distribution, modeling the actual offenses, where the actual gun offense takes place in the actual local neighborhood. So again, this is an ecological study, so we're not making correlations between everyone in this neighborhood is a criminal or whatnot, but to try to understand if there are some neighborhoods where it is more likely there will be gun-related offenses, so understanding where the vulnerable neighborhood lies. So looking at all sorts of different indicators that we know are general predictors for poor health outcomes, but also oftentimes are more prone as crime-related neighborhoods, we see things like a proportion of recent immigrants often have a higher vulnerability, high proportion of renters in the neighborhood, so thinking about residential stability, high proportion of young people, as we know, as a vulnerable population, male youth, levels of education of adults, unemployment rate for young people, for adults, for males specifically, looking at average household income, all of these things as predictors of vulnerability, but also predictors of whether or not a gun-related offense may be more or less likely to occur in the neighborhood. And then looking at mobility, so knowing not only renters in the neighborhood, but also the mobility of in and out of the neighborhood, not being able to have that stability that neighborhoods need to be stronger places and safer places. So what we found in looking at that, so in modeling this will make no sense because this is a very difficult table to interpret, but essentially all of those and all of these indicators were included in the model, tested in the model, and also all of the interactions between the variables to see how things work together. So this is the outcome model, which isn't helpful to see, except that these are the most statistically significant, these are the most predictive variables in the model, the most statistically significant ones. The more interesting piece is looking at how each of the individual variables in that model actually impact the outcome of likelihood of whether or not gun-related offenses will occur in a neighborhood. So the biggest predictors, so the biggest impact from this model and whether or not a gun-related offense will occur in the neighborhood, the largest one being percent of adults without a high school education. So you can see these tables are showing, these charts are showing when you take one variable in the top left corner, the case of percentage of adults without high school diploma. As you move towards low percentage to mid percentage to high percentage, the likelihood of actually having a gun-related offense occur in that neighborhood is quite high. So that is actually the largest impact variable when you hold all of the other variables constant in that model. So it's just showing the relative impact of each of these predictor variables. So we see adults without high school diploma in the neighborhood is a strong predictor. We see percentage of rental dwellings being one of the strongest predictors. So the number of people who are renting, thinking about moving in and out of a neighborhood and the stability of those neighborhoods also being a very large predictor. Recent immigrants, not so much, nor household income, except as a protective factor among the very highest neighborhoods, which is quite intuitive. Percentage of male youth unemployment, again, being one of the larger predictors of whether or not gun-related offense will occur in the neighborhood. So again, that being one of the big ones. So the three biggest neighborhood level predictors, adult education levels, proportion of rental dwellings, and male youth unemployment. Again, knowing that this is not a causal correlation, but understanding that this is an ecological correlation between aggregate level data and individual outcomes, so not pegging individuals in those neighborhoods. So understanding that there are vulnerable pieces we can understand in Peel, specifically around some of these pieces, while trying to understand, well, if we know this about certain types of neighborhoods, and we know where certain offenses take place, and we work with our community advisory committee to get some input on local knowledge around vulnerable neighborhoods. The second piece of the research actually was this observational survey tool. So going into neighborhoods to figure out if we can walk around neighborhoods, if residents can take part in it to better understand some of the strengths in neighborhoods and also some of the challenges with respect to crime and safety. It's fine for us to say, well, this is what we think is important, but obviously living in a neighborhood is very, very different when you actually figure out what you think is important as a resident, what's bothering you, what's making you feel unsafe, or what's great about your neighborhood that actually isn't an issue that we might think it is. So this survey tool looked at residential and commercial conditions, so looked at things like security, surveillance, green spaces, incivilities, as well as civilities, so looking at things like graffiti or signs of maintenance. A lot of the survey was based on crime prevention through environmental design, which I'm sure some of you will already know about or will hear about later today. Also public spaces, so land use, lighting, maintenance, roadworks, transportation options, and then some of the amenities around health and health promotion. So this survey actually combined elements of crime prevention through environmental design with elements from surveys you'll see on health promotion, walkability, things you need for health and well-being, to think of the two not as disconnected entities, but as something that we need to think about around safe neighborhoods, but also healthy neighborhoods. Also looked at social activities and interactions, so actually observing what's happening in the neighborhood. Are there places where people are informally gathering? Are there indicators of hostility? Does it look like it's a safe place to walk around in the daytime and in the evening? So what we did was we selected 3 neighborhoods based on our phase 1, so mapping out these gun-related offenses in collaboration with the Community Advisory Committee who helped select neighborhoods. And what the plan was is to go into each of these selected pilot neighborhoods 4 times. So once in the evening on a weekday, once in the evening on a weekend, once in the daytime on a weekday, and once in the daytime on a weekend, to get a better sense of the transient things that are happening, but also to get a more representative picture of what's happening in daytime and at nighttime on 4 different days. So you get a better sense of what's happening in the neighborhood as someone who's not a resident of that neighborhood. I also took exhaustive photos throughout the process, as well as an audio recording of what's happening in the neighborhood. Here are the 3 neighborhoods we selected in collaboration with the advisory committee: the Queen and Kennedy area in Brampton, King and Queen in Bolton in Caledon, and Hurontario and Dundas in Mississauga. So looking at some of the characteristics of just those specific local areas that we were walking through compared to their municipal average, we see the first CT1 is actually our Caledon neighborhood, so that Queen and King area in Bolton. So looking at rates of things like adults, percentage of adults without high school diplomas, or percentage of renters, we're actually seeing that these neighborhoods were selected based on some of the criteria around what we know is making neighborhoods vulnerable, but a lot of the neighborhood selection process almost entirely occurred through the Community Advisory Committee, not necessarily from the results of the initial piece, but when we actually compare the results of why people selected these neighborhoods with these characteristics, we saw that they were one and the same, that there were some key issues like very high percentage of renters. You can see CT2 being the Brampton neighborhood, CT3 being the Mississauga neighborhood. So actually you're seeing double the rates here, with Mississauga's average proportion of renters per neighborhood being 25%, and you see the Mississauga neighborhood we looked in at 55, similarly with Brampton at 19, and the Brampton, Queen and Kennedy area we looked at 63% being renters. And again, you see that although this is quite a high number here for relative to Caledon, low compared to the other 2. So actually going into these neighborhoods now and figuring out what it is that's going on in these neighborhoods, well, we see this is, I'm not going to go through these in detail, but this is a sense of the types of checklists we had that we went through a number of times in each, as I mentioned, each neighborhood. So the types of things we were looking at when we're looking at structural maintenance of both commercial and residential buildings, knowing that the more maintenance that is done on a neighborhood in general, the less likely incivilities, so things like garbage, litter, graffiti, things like that, are less likely to occur. So this is just examples. I've just used a consistent Brampton example throughout. Some of the things we're looking at around residential maintenance, for example. This is an example of low residential maintenance. Looking at things, signs of security and surveillance, thinking about territorial functioning. So when you look after your property and people are looking after their property, there's a lot less likelihood of something to be less likely for an offender to actually commit a crime. So the different types of things we were looking out for. So examples of high evidence that local residents as well as businesses are looking out for ensuring that their property or their community is not being vandaled or whatnot. Green spaces, all the types of things that we know are healthy for residents. So thinking about access to parklands, public spaces, public recreational facilities, grassy spaces, are there groomed trails for walking or cycling, outdoor facilities like that. So looking at the types of things that we know are health promoting, but also encourage neighbors to get together and actually connect in an informal way. Are there nice places to stop and where you might meet a resident, and why that's good for us. So example again in Brampton of that neighborhood actually having a lot of really great green spaces and trails to spend time. Looking at incivilities, as I mentioned, things like litter, garbage, other evidence of social disorder or residents not engaging in the community to all contribute to making the community a clean and safe space beyond the perimeter of their own residence. So some examples, as well as graffiti exclusively, whether or not it's just for fun graffiti or the types that are more aligned with things like intimidation or turf messages or gang indicators, things like that, that are certainly the things that we know contribute to residential fear and perceptions of safety in the neighborhood. So some example of lots of incivilities in the Brampton neighborhood, for example, seeing some of the things that are quite discouraging as a resident if you're passing by every day, as a young person passing by every day, that aren't helpful for the neighborhood as a whole. So in summarizing just these 3 pilot neighborhoods of going through and actually walking through with this observational survey, well, what did we learn? Well, we learned that when we actually see these high proportion of rental neighborhoods in many cases, that there could very well be a lot less engagement with the local community by the residents, and we noticed that the maintenance was quite a bit lower in a couple in Mississauga and Brampton in that case, around the fact that if you're a renter, your vested interest of keeping outside of your residence maintained may very well be a lot lower, especially if you don't know necessarily your neighbors, you don't engage with the community in that way, and you think your time in that area is quite temporary with a renter mentality. We saw different pieces around levels of security, incivilities, as I mentioned, things like that. The one thing that came out of all of them that stood out quite apart, where they all had different variation around some of these key things around maintenance, security, and civilities, was opportunities for youth. All 3 neighborhoods had very limited to no opportunities for young people. And I'm not talking about children and playgrounds, because there was lots of child-size opportunities for recreation like playgrounds, but there were no opportunities for actual young people to be engaged. And when we know what we know about vulnerability of young people to crime, and we look around local neighborhoods, there wasn't a lot for a young person on a day-to-day basis to actually be walking around being engaged in. So that was something that came out of this quite strongly. The next piece of the research, as I mentioned, was actually going and following up in those 3 neighborhoods to actually conduct interviews with local service providers in the neighborhood to figure out what are the main opportunities and challenges for each of these 3 neighborhoods, the one in Queen and King in Bolton, Queen and Kennedy in Brampton, and Hurontario and Dundas in Mississauga. So that link to both, so these opportunities and challenges that link to both crime, safety, and health and well-being at a local level. So interviewing service providers, youth, longtime residents, school officials, police representatives, people that are working and intimately can speak about the residents and the opportunities and the challenges in the neighborhood. So it's just a summary of who we spoke to through this work. Some of the key themes that came from all of the interviews across the board and thinking about what's happening in each of those neighborhoods and then also what's happening more broadly is the social ties in the community. Thinking about needing more social ties between residents, among service providers and residents in the community, the influence of things like the built environment, housing form and housing density in particular, and how likely or less likely it is that neighbors actually know each other. The lack of opportunities for informal social gatherings as being something that helps bolster social support. Needing opportunities for youth came out very strongly across all of the interviews. And thinking about transients as vulnerable populations, so having high proportions of renters, making it very difficult for neighborhoods to be strong in just that knowing each other, feeling safe, and knowing you can count on someone locally in your neighborhood if something's not right, or recognizing when something isn't right, because you actually know the people more intimately. Things around social trust and collective efficacy, so when I know someone, I trust someone, I'm more likely to act out. And thinking about incivilities as spiraling, like the broken windows theory. See a broken window, no one does anything about it. You see it happen more and more and more. So that came out throughout the interviews as well. Again, the idea of transients making it difficult to build social trust and having that collective efficacy among residents. And then also the community reputation and stigma. So having a lot of incivilities, a lot of graffiti in your neighborhood, it doesn't look good, it doesn't make residents feel good, and that's something that resonated with the service providers as well. So I'm sure you all know what local social ties are, but dense social networks in a neighborhood, things like barbecues or neighborhood associations, can deter crime, for example, even benefiting neighborhoods who don't even participate in the barbecues or belong to the associations. Just knowing that they're there can be very healthy. Things around social or mutual trust, to be able to build meaningful social relationships. We know that crime rates are lower in neighborhoods where social trust is high. A collective efficacy, so the capacity for more social control, so keeping an eye on what's happening in the neighborhood, and knowing that when collective efficacy is high in very cohesive neighborhoods where there's lots of social trust, so knowing that these are things we need to bolster in our neighborhoods and knowing that they're good for health, knowing that these came out of the key informant interviews as things that we know are good for health, but we also know are good for safety and crime prevention. So some of the actual quotes from key informant interviews, so these local service providers in each of the neighborhoods, the issues around high renters and high turnover. How do you know your neighbors when you're recycling the housing experience? So if you invest time into this particular population or this family this month, well, you don't know if they're going to be there next month. So this is a challenge not only for residents, but it's also a challenge for service providers. Having a roster of clients passing through your doors that may or may not be repeating is a challenge. Again, looking at high density areas as in the same idea is that there's so many people you don't know. You're less inclined to help someone that you've never met or never seen or aren't even sure if they're your neighbor. I mean, this just makes sense. It's something that is a constant struggle as a newcomer to a new neighborhood, particularly in a high dense building. Building neighborhood connections. When people start talking, getting to know each other, then you want to look out for each other. This is something that we all can relate to. A bigger piece, again, is being able to connect some of these places together. The service provider from Brampton says, so the schools, being connected with the neighborhood, opening their doors for residents, having businesses get to know their clients. So the idea that there are existing facilities and opening them up and having more opportunities for informal gathering and meeting is better for the neighborhood when you actually get to know each other. Looking at residential dynamics in the invisible poor, that it's not only just high-rise where we're getting high density, but we're also getting high density within residential single-unit houses. So renting out basements becoming more common, renting out legally or not, renting out rooms as well within a house. So the idea that the family unit being a residence is not always the case. We're getting multiple families in houses, which we know, which again makes it difficult when you don't know your neighbors and there are so many people within houses that you don't know what's going on as a resident. Looking again at places for informal gatherings, opportunities to meet one another don't occur in a natural space came out quite a bit in different ways, and how having those informal gatherings, in depth or not, does give more meaning and does also, as this service provider mentions, takes away the social isolation that many people feel when they're living in a neighborhood and they don't know anyone. They don't know who their neighbors are. So having those opportunities for informal gatherings. Also, positive opportunities for youth came out across the board, as I mentioned in our survey. Throughout the neighborhoods, it came out, but also talking to these different informants. I think because I'm not targeting young people themselves, but because there's a lack of things to do and a lack of positive spaces to attend to, you can see how it might actually lead to crime as a result of the lack of resources and supports and systems within the neighborhood for youth. And again, not children, but those young people. Again, not only opportunities, but affordable opportunities. So the opportunities are there, but financial constraints are an issue. As a police official in Caledon says, it costs a lot of money to send your kid to anything that's organized because there's dues to pay, fees to pay, you've got to get them there, you've got to bring them back, and that's difficult. Not everyone has that parent or support network to get them there. So that's certainly a barrier, not to the actual cost as well as opportunities. And then just comparing here the idea that we don't just need resources for children, but we need resources for young people. Places where they're not going to get kicked out for loitering, places where they can just be left alone to spend time, not necessarily in a highly organized activity, but even in unstructured ones as well. For that middle group of young people, as this service provider in Mississauga says, not just about the young people, but actually the age before they have access to other resources on their own. Looking at the broken windows theory, particularly the idea that yes, people treat things badly that look badly. So when it's clean, people have a tendency to pick up. So the idea that that sometimes beautifying neighborhoods can have a very positive effect, an image on the residents as well, and also lead to the idea of picking up around the neighborhood a little bit more once it looks revitalized. But obviously, it's very discouraging to see an overwhelming level of, say, litter, for example, or graffiti. And finally, the presence of incivilities in some of these neighborhoods. This was a Mississauga example. Also, not only gives us a bit of a stigma around the neighborhood itself among residents, but also the idea that perceptions of safety decline when you see incivilities in a neighborhood. So the perception out there in Mississauga that this place is really ghetto, there's a perception that the neighborhood's not safe because of the appearance of certain parts of it. So that can be troublesome, obviously, for residents as well as service providers in bolstering the image that this is a great place to live. Maybe we need to work on the cosmetics of it a little, at least initially. So a lot of pieces of the puzzle in thinking about what can we assess from this overall very good news story about where our crime rates are at in Canada, in Toronto, in Peel, in Mississauga, and Brampton, and Caledon, to figure out if we can, with certain pieces of data, understand local level variation and understand what are the pieces that we might be missing and what are the things that resonate with service providers, what resonates with residents as well. So what we learned from this project from the environmental analysis, so comparing crime rates to local conditions in neighborhoods, is that while we did see that gun-related offenses as just one type of offense, not evenly distributed throughout the region, 60% of the offenses committed by young people under the age of 25. Risk factors at the local neighborhood level point to neighborhoods with high proportions of renters, high proportions of adults with low education, and high proportions of male youth unemployment. So this is not surprising and something that we know anecdotally from throughout the region, but also we know from statistics in other areas. However, the location of gun offenses, as I mentioned, was not the location of the residence of the offenders. We know that there is no causal relationship that we can claim between a neighborhood level conditions and actual what's happening among any individual in that neighborhood. Again, this is the analysis based on one type of offense and does not include all offenses or focus on the most vulnerable populations. And so certainly this is not a more complete picture of Peel than you had before, but it's a start in thinking about what else we don't know and what we need to know a little bit more about at the local level to understand what's happening in terms of variation around vulnerability to crime and also how that links inherently to health and well-being. The observational survey and interviews emphasized the assets and challenges of each neighborhood and also identified some really common themes that high levels of transients or high levels of renters sometimes equated with lower levels of commercial or residential maintenance, so seeing more incivilities as well. So higher levels of incivilities, knowing that that does indicate that there are lower levels of social trust and certainly lots of lower levels of perceived safety, and then again the stigma of living in neighborhoods that have a lot of incivilities, a lot of garbage, a lot of graffiti is obviously not helpful. And thinking about local residential pride and satisfaction. That there were lots of opportunities and spaces for children, but not very many opportunities actually for young people. So thinking about what we need to meaningfully engage young people. And that there were very few spaces for informal social gatherings among residents, so places that just naturally people would stop maybe, or that places that looked ideal to stop and have a conversation or meet another neighbor, particularly in areas where there's high density and you may not have a front yard at your luxury to spend time and watch people passing by. Also, certainly illustrated that there were lots of good existing infrastructure and resources, so things like schools, commercial zones, and green spaces as potential sites for more engagement, and certainly where engagement is already occurring, but maybe there's opportunity for more. So some of the recommendations from this work, thinking about ways to bolster social ties or support, thinking about mutual trust, collective efficacy among residents, one approach to both reducing crime and increasing health and well-being at the same time, thinking that they are interconnected. Working with existing community infrastructure, so building on spaces or places that already exist to encourage more informal social interactions among residents, places that are already working as well, enhancing them in any ways that we can. Finding ways to get people out of their homes and into the community, especially among newcomers and transient neighborhoods, so with high rental populations. So these will obviously require more support on an ongoing basis, knowing that the same people will not necessarily be there next time, so that these are areas that not a one-time intervention will work necessarily, but something that can be more sustainable and will continually encourage a new influx of people to get out and get to know their neighbors. Also knowing that one size clearly does not fit all, that there are some common challenges and lots of common opportunities, but every neighborhood obviously is unique and not everything is going to work for every neighborhood. So just some community examples of ways of that we know of, ways of getting people out, knowing their neighbors. The 2001 United in Action Day by the United Way of Peel Region. This was the final piece of the 3 neighborhood project. Was actually, we did a cleanup project focusing on the graffiti and litter, and then introducing art murals around some of the areas where graffiti was the worst. So each initiative, as I mentioned, that one size doesn't fit all, they all evolved very differently. So the Caledon, Mississauga, and Brampton local neighborhood projects looked quite different in terms of what the United in Action Day looked like. But it was a really neat way to get different local community members and key organizations working together and building partnerships, having some conversations about these local neighborhoods. So there was lots of different partners, as you can see, that worked on each of those 3 neighborhoods. And so you can see here some of the art murals that were done by young people in the community, and some before and after pictures of, for example, the ladies' washroom in Bolton at the Bolton Soccer Club started off about a graffiti writer never gets caught, and then it ended up as a beautiful girls' washroom sign. So things like that before and after with the Bolton Soccer. So that was a great way to get community members out and to get some awareness around that, and hopefully build some initial connections anyways, knowing this was, again, a one-time deal. As I mentioned, ongoing initiatives and ongoing opportunities for residents being necessary. Some other community examples: Safe City, Mississauga, with Neighbourhood Watch, a newly reformed version of Neighbourhood Watch, which is really exciting, and also their Neighbourhoods Night Out a program, basically assisting residents in neighbourhood inventories, so crime prevention through environmental design. So having residents going through understanding what parts of their neighbourhoods may be more or less crime prone. Also facilitating connection building, so having block parties, information sessions on a more ongoing basis so we can build those connections and have those connections across time among residents. Also providing resources to help residents report or remove graffiti, being something that we know is very helpful in terms of what residents need and what's important around stigma and reputation of a neighborhood. Brampton Safe City also has some similar initiatives with their Good Neighbors, Great Neighborhoods program of making sure neighbors actually get to know each other, knowing your neighbors. Other recommendations in rounding the bend here are that opportunities for youth clearly must be a priority for prevention. Works towards crime prevention and positive youth development, which is something that I'm very passionate about, also through my role at PCYI. So focusing on accessible, appropriate, and enjoyable educational, work and volunteer, recreation, and after-school opportunities for young people as being a common theme coming out of this, knowing that they're the most vulnerable population to becoming involved in crime. Certainly there are many organizations already contributing to crime prevention through a focus on youth, whether they are doing it directly or consciously or unconsciously. And so this research certainly demonstrates the importance of their work. So some other community examples of particular initiatives and funding streams, certainly at the Peel Children and Youth Initiative. So our recreation and after-school strategy will be launching soon, that includes a lot of opportunities around what young people need that we know will contribute to crime prevention, but also contributes to a healthy future population and healthy, positive youth development, which is what we're after. United Way Peel Region just unveiled their new investment strategy, All That Kids Can Be. So again, along the same lines of what we're all thinking about here. So we are getting some community traction around these ideas that supporting youth is actually preventing crime. And the Region of Peel's Summer Employment Challenge, so looking at, they have a program where they actually hire some young people who may be more vulnerable, may not have access to jobs, and knowing that that's a big predictor. So giving young people hope and a job certainly helps with things like future outcomes, post-secondary horizon, things like that. So addressing upstream roots of crime and or violence is the most efficient way to prevent youth and adults from entering the justice system, as we know, and as we've been hearing a lot about. So thinking about our average crime rates, they may very well be quite low, and we know that they are, but there's a lot more behind the scenes of our crime rates, particularly for youth, that we don't fully understand, in addition to local variation, that there's a lot that Peel Police does, and outreach. So again, as I mentioned, 80% is prevention and 20% is actually laying charges with young people when we think about what youth, what the situation is with young people. And finally, certainly the need to continue discussing ways that we can share data among key community partners, so like Peel Regional Police, but also other agencies that are working with young people in different ways, so that we can better understand how multiple sectors are actually collectively influencing outcomes related to crime and the health and well-being of our residents. So thinking that we know it's not just about what Peel Police is doing, for example, but there are all these other agencies that are working directly and indirectly to move the dot along for all of our residents, and how until we have a little more dialogue, a little more sharing of data to understand how these multiple sectors are working together, we don't actually know which interventions are the best. So, so certainly sharing data is something that hopefully will get increasing traction here in the region. And that's it. I just have a few acknowledgements. The funding for the project was from a neighborhood development grant co-funded by the Region of Peel and United Way of Peel Region. Also some funding and support for mapping from Safe City Mississauga. Research partners on the project, you can see there. And also had a lot of help with student support throughout that, and with staff and faculty from UTM. And so that's it. Hopefully didn't talk too quickly, but if anyone has any questions or comments, if there's time, I'd be happy to take them. Yep. Yes, I think Safe City Mississauga will have the presentations accessible, certainly as a piece, but I can certainly email them to you as well. Well, so these were we only actually got to engage with one young person. We had some ethics issues around recruitment around young people, so we weren't actually able to identify a lot of young people to participate. But thinking about the difficulty of some, these are very localized neighborhoods, of course. I'm not talking about the huge area. There's a lot more detail that I didn't want to get into, but that they're very small pockets. So we actually looked at dissemination areas, which is a 500 to 700 population size. So walking around that particular neighborhood. So we were trying to focus on what this neighborhood needs and showing service providers, here's a map of the neighborhood we're talking about. Here's sort of the intersection, for example, in Mississauga, Hurontario, and Dundas. Thinking about that there isn't a lot in this neighborhood. If you're living there, knowing that young people are pretty constrained to their neighborhood environments, and there's only so much outside of school and home you can do in a day, especially on a weekday, that thinking about the day-to-day opportunities just might not be there. So, and not necessarily being able to travel to maybe a rec center or other opportunities, that there weren't in the immediate neighborhood something that youth could just attend to. So whether it's a drop-in center or whether it's a place in the park that's like a skate park, for example, that came up a couple of times, that there are some, but not for the day-to-day. It's more of a special occasion or a weekend activity. So thinking about what can we have in immediate neighborhood, what's more immediate for the day-to-day. So it's an after-school program or it's a recreation program that is accessible, not necessarily a geographic barrier to get there. So I think that's what came out more often than not.
The area of Douglas and Helene is often been cited as an area of concern with respect to crime and violence. But have you studied really sort of correlation between natural criminal activity with that specific area?
I didn't have access to any local level crime data other than these gun-related offenses particularly. So everything else is from what local service providers would explain. The actual selection of the neighborhoods, so we did the mapping, we did some modeling around where sort of risk factors. We didn't say let's pop out crime stats. I don't have any other crime statistics on those local level areas, so I can't comment on it. It's not something that we have access to at present. But the three neighborhoods, so Hurontario and Dundas being one of them, was selected as a priority neighborhood from that community advisory list, and I'm sure I won't be able to get to it very quickly because there's 1,000 slides. But that was identified as, from all of those service providers, as that's an area that actually that they would like to see a more local assessment. And so actually the selection of it didn't come from the crime data necessarily. It came from these people.
Just a follow-up. You said you did not have access to stats. Is there that it's actually the data that you just didn't get it, or is it that?
Local level crime data in terms of property crime is not available at this point. I think there are a lot of privacy concerns, obviously, around releasing local level data. Safe City Mississauga and Brampton Safe City do get some larger aggregate levels, so you can compare places around, and maybe Ashley can comment on this a little bit more, but between Brampton versus Mississauga, but there's not, we don't really have access to local level information around stats at present. The gun-related database was a one-time opportunity through a partnership with the Crown Attorney's Office for the Region of Peel, not through necessarily accessing data from Peel Regional Police. So these are offenses that have gone through the courts and have become public. So that's how we had the access to it, not through any other breach of confidentiality. So. Yeah, and to clarify, sorry, that's been a very recent and exciting initiative actually by Peel Regional Police, and this research project began 2.5 years ago, so and has been finished for some time. So this is not something that we had access to at the time, and certainly, and I'm not sure, are we able to download? It's more of a you can visually see. You can visually see what's happening, and you can also do it by time. Is that right? Yes. So. Yeah, so you can visually see what's happening in your neighborhood now. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Any other questions? Great. Yep, well, and sorry, where did you say you worked? Sorry, it's fine, okay. So I thought you mentioned that. I wasn't trying to make it uncomfortable. Actually, it's a really interesting question, and something that through the Peel Children and Youth Initiative, one of the things we're working on, obviously this is my hat as PCYI. This research predates that to an extent. But the exciting thing is there's lots of synergy right now in the community, I think in Peel, around understanding that there are some gaps around getting young people to opportunities, or making sure opportunities are available, or that young people are aware of them, or that there are more quality opportunities for young people. So an exciting thing at the Peel Children and Youth Initiative is we're working on a recreation and after-school strategy that has about 25 recommendations all around. It's a 5-year plan, so it's not tomorrow we need it done, but some ideas, and my boss Graham is in the back, who could probably answer the question more articulately. But the idea that that there are a number of things that we're hoping to do for young people, for example, and some recommendations that's going to involve a little more working together among key stakeholders, some more dedicated resources to young people, not only vulnerable populations, but all young people. So figuring out there are some things we want to make sure all young people have access to. And there are certain pieces around, like what you said, that maybe there are resources already there, but maybe the young people don't know about them. So thinking about dedicated youth outreach workers who can actually make sure that these people, the ones we know aren't making it through our doors, these are the people that we need to have engaged in some way, making sure that the right facilities are at the right places, and also that there are subsidies for, this thing is doing something. That there are also subsidies in place for the young people who can't access them either financially or for other reasons. So there's a lot of exciting work coming out of that, and I think there's a lot of support throughout the community around the idea that youth need support, and that's a great way for health, it's a great way for education, and it's a great way for safety and crime prevention as well. So there's a lot of good reasons that we can all work together around that. So I think things are coming, absolutely, and I think the dialogue is just is really becoming quite ripe right now for making sure that that youth are caught, the ones that fall through certain cracks at certain ages, being critical.
Is there any consideration taking the place of existing federally funded programs that are already available for research to youth such as that program?
In this research? No, not necessarily. So this really was a neighborhood assessment of crime and safety, not necessarily of youth opportunities. Inadvertently and unexpectedly, youth came out as a very strong concern among everyone we spoke to, and also from our data showed that there were few opportunities in these particular just case studies of walking through these neighborhoods. It's not representative of Peel, not representative of each of those municipalities, but the idea that here's some interesting crime data for Mississauga and Brampton, what can we glean from it? Here's a neat idea around measuring neighborhoods, walking through in a social observation point, and then here's a neat way to talk to actual service providers who are working in these neighborhoods to try to link back these three sort of aggregate level data, local level, walking through neighborhoods, and then actually anecdotal from service providers who are working with community residents as a whole. So we weren't focusing on youth necessarily, but youth came out as one of the biggest messages. So that was an exciting thing to see. You know, I'm obviously very passionate about young people, but it also seems to be something resonating with the community at large right now, which is great. So no, we weren't measuring funding pockets in this, but certainly something that, as a policy piece, is very is critical and timely. Right? Great. Thank you very much.